Okay, colleagues, welcome to our seminar today. My name is Andreas Bieler, and I was one of the attendees at the water workshop last year in Hanover, co-organized by Andrea, Mira, Madeleine Moore, and others. And at the workshop, we decided that one way of moving forward in staying in touch, but also in building the network, was by establishing a kind of a lunchtime seminar series. It can be monthly, it can be bi-monthly. It was Laila and myself who were put in charge of organizing this session. So in a way, today is the inauguration of this lunchtime seminar series. The focus is on the troubles of the private water industry in the UK. The industry is failing. To those of us here, this is not a surprise at all. But of course, it's also quite an interesting test case of what the response is and what are the alternatives currently being discussed of how to move forward. And I'm very pleased to welcome two experts in this area, Kate Bayliss and David Hall, who have worked for many years on the UK water industry. And I look forward to them illuminating to us a bit what's actually happening at this point in time. So David Hall is a visiting professor at the Public Services International Research Unit, PSIRU, of which he is also the former director. And in turn, Kate Bayliss is a research associate with the Department of Economics and a member of the Centre for Water and Development at SOAS, the University of London. Now, both have, as I said, worked extensively on the water industry, also with a specific focus on the UK. And Kate will go first in our seminar and talk for 15 minutes about her work on private equity, Macquarie, that investment fund, as well as the financialisation of the water system and the impossibility of regulation. This will then be followed by David, who is going to talk about investments, dividends, and the political context of the UK water industries. And then once we've had both presentations, we will then still have about 25 minutes for questions, discussions, and comments before at the next hour, for me here in the UK, 1 p.m., I'm then going to hand over to Andrea for the second part from 1 to 1:30 roughly, when there will be a discussion about the further development of this water network. So welcome everyone, colleagues. Kate, I'm handing over to you for the first 15 minutes, and I'm perhaps going to give you a sign 3 minutes towards the end of your 15 minutes, if that's okay. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks so much, Andreas. And thank you so much for inviting me to come and join this group. I'm delighted to be in such illustrious company. So I'm going to talk about the water system in the UK, and I'm aware that some of you will know this really well and some of you might not know so much. So I'm going to skim over a lot of stuff, but we can talk about more details later on if we need to. So the first thing, I'm going to cover four areas more or less. I'm going to talk about the crises that we're facing. I'm talking about water in England and Wales. I need to make this point. It's not Scotland or Northern Ireland, but I quite often easily slip into UK. So when I say UK, I usually mean just England and Wales. Scotland and Northern Ireland have quite different systems. I'm going to talk about the crises, and talk about how we got here, and then talk about regulation. Where was regulation in all of this? And then talk briefly about where we're going, about the future. So firstly, then, water's in the headlines of the newspapers every day, pretty much in the UK at the moment. The two big issues are finance and sewage issues. So on finance, as Andreas said, Thames Water, which is our biggest water company, it operates water in London and the southeast. It serves something like a quarter of the UK population. Huge company is due to run out of money on the 24th of March, so in 3 days' time, when a bond was due to be repaid. So the company is really highly indebted, has debts of more than £19 billion now that it can't service. So it was close to financial collapse, but they've just agreed to take on an emergency loan to keep them going. So a collection of hedge funds that bought some of the company's debt last year cheaply has agreed to lend Thames Water £3 billion. But this is expensive. It's coming at an interest rate of nearly 10%. And the other costs added in, I mean, the whole cost of Thames, the water utility, is going to be about £800 million. So these costs have been described as eye-watering. And the company's already spending £15 million a month on fees to lawyers and advisors. So this loan is intended to give the company time to kind of breathe while it organizes the restructuring and gets in more equity. But all the public debate is about raising private investment. But the real issue is bills, because this is where the money comes from. This is the company's only revenue source. So Thames Water is trying to increase water bills substantially. They've been allowed to increase them by 35%, aside from inflation, but they have appealed to us to increase prices more. And nearly a third of bills is going to pay debt service. So it's not just about bills for investment, it's about bills to make sure that financial investors are happy. So Thames is by far the worst case, but Southern Water also is in a shaky financial situation. And water companies shouldn't be like this. Something's gone very badly wrong. We have a very predictable revenue stream of water, and you know what you're going to spend. So this has been a bit of a massive governance failing. And then sewage spills. This has been coming to light more and more in the UK, in England, Wales, and in the UK more generally. It's mainly come to light through the work of campaign groups that have seen the state of rivers and seas declining. Basically, our wastewater treatment system can't cope with the sewage that it has to deal with. And the idea is that in an emergency, they are allowed to spill sewage into clean rivers and seas, but this is happening on a routine basis now. And there's been a huge public outcry, lots of campaigning around this, but still the level of sewage spills is increasing. There's a 54% increase on the number of spills in 2023 compared to 2022. And this is a disaster. It's devastating for wildlife. It's also a public health issue. A number of people being admitted to hospital with diseases from waterborne infection increased by 60% between 2010 and 2023. So alongside these high debts, sewage spills, we're also seeing high payments of dividends to shareholders over the years, payments to directors in the millions of pounds each year in some cases, and now water bills are supposed to be increasing. So this has contributed to growing public anger, and public trust is at an all-time low. So things are going really badly with our water system, basically. So how did we get here? Our water system is organized via 10 regional water and sewage companies and some smaller water-only companies. And these were privatized in 1989, privatized by being floated on the stock exchange, so anyone could buy shares. But since then, there's been a shift in ownership. Companies have been taken off the stock exchange. So we have 3 out of these 10 water and sewage companies, 3 are still listed on the stock exchange. One of them, Welsh Water, is owned by a not-for-profit company. 2 have been delisted and they're owned by Asian large conglomerates. And the remaining 4 water and sewage companies, which actually provide over half the water and sewage in the country, are owned by financial investors. So we have private equity funds, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and all the water-only companies are owned by these financial investors. So I've identified 3 issues with private equity owning water companies. So these financial structures are extremely opaque. So you have a water utility as a single company, which is the licensed provider of water and sewage. But when you have private equity owners, this one company is located within a wider corporate structure with a wide series of holding companies between the operating company and then the ultimate owners. And these companies transfer funds to and from each other in company loans, payments of interest, dividends. It's really hard to trace where the money goes with these structures. And it's not clear who the ultimate owner is. If we look at Southern Water, it was taken over in 2021 by Macquarie, but it's actually owned by a fund that's registered in Luxembourg, the Macquarie Supercore Infrastructure Fund. And this fund itself has two subsidiary funds that actually are also registered in Luxembourg. And these then have the stake in the ultimate parent of company also registered in Jersey offshore. So we don't know who ultimately benefits from these dividends that are paid. So that's the first issue with private equity ownership. It's not transparent. Second point is a much sharper attention to financial extraction. This is associated with private equity generally, but it's particularly problematic if it's, we're talking about a water company here. So if the owner is an investment fund, there's a very sharp incentive to increase the value of the fund. The fund manager, pretty much their goal is to increase the fund value. And that means making as much of a return as possible in whatever the fund invests in. This is the priority, far more so than employee or consumer welfare or environmental stuff. That's the first point with the financial extraction. But also there's a huge separation geographically and institutionally between the operations. So you've got the water user, the staff, the environment. That's really far away from the ultimate company investors in some offshore fund. They might not even know what the fund's investing in. And the third point about private equity ownership is debt. So private equity funds traditionally operate with very high debt levels. And we've seen in the water sector, private equity investors used a special financial engineering process to increase water company debt levels substantially, which enabled them in part to refinance the acquisition debt. So the cost of buying the company becomes allocated to the utility itself. It's then the water company's debt, not the investor's debt. So this is problematic, these debt stuff, this debt financing. Firstly, because of fairness. So we're all paying our water bills. Why should we pay for a debt that's not financing infrastructure, but it's financing dividends? It's allowed companies to buy the company in the first place. There's fairness. And the second point as well, we're seeing with Thames, companies that are highly indebted are more vulnerable if circumstances change. So if we see interest rates go up or inflation, as we're seeing with Thames, or if companies are forced to pay a fine, as you're seeing with Thames, then this is a vulnerability from private equity ownership. So Thames itself is a kind of archetype of this financialized private equity ownership. It was owned for 10 years by Macquarie, who also now own Southern. That's kind of, they've got a very strong role in our water system. And in that time, debts increased hugely. They paid out a lot in dividends, and they've never really recovered. So now with inflation and interest rates rising, the debts have gone higher, and they are in a big mess as a result. So on regulation then, on the sewage spills, I just want to mention quickly about the sewage spills. It's not that, so Thames Water and Southern Water, both private equity owned, are by far the worst performers, but it's happening across all sectors. So it's not necessarily a financialization issue. With sewage, it seems to be very strongly linked to profit motive combined with weak regulation. I mean, environmental regulation has, since 2009, has been based around a system of companies monitoring their own environmental performance, which is obviously problematic. And at the same time, we've seen cuts in funding for the environmental regulator, which seem to be quite clearly what's led to underinvestment and the pollution that we're seeing. But economic regulation, I want to just talk a bit about that, because this is where the main energy is in regulation. So this takes the form of price controls, where prices are set in advance every 5 years. And it's based on performance against past targets and anticipated costs. So both of these seem to be subject to intensive negotiation. So the price setting is worth huge amounts to the water companies. So there's an awful lot of money, consultants, lawyers advisors being brought in by the companies and the regulators to negotiate this price increase, this price setting process. And so in 2024, in December last year, the regulator approved price increases of 36% for the following 5 years, 2025 and to 2030. But a number of companies are appealing against this. They want to increase prices more. So I just want to talk about the limits of regulation. So regulation has led in two massive goals. We've seen the state of Thames Water and the sewage crisis. So regulation has really, really failed. So I think regulation is impossibly constrained. I'm just going to say why I think this is the case. So in both cases, the first point I want to make is like a failure of imagination. Regulation is based on a kind of implicit assumption of how we think the private sector is going to operate. We think it's a kind of benign private company that will become more efficient to make more profits, to generate dividends, which will be deserved. We didn't think they would use financial engineering to take profits. We didn't think they wouldn't bother to invest in wastewater treatment. So
3 more minutes, Kate.
Was that 1 minute?
3 more minutes.
3 more minutes. Oh gosh. Okay. The second point about regulation is this idea of the market framework. The whole regulatory structure understands water in terms of an imperfect market. So for that reason, they didn't intervene in debt, dividends, or directors' pay. These are seen as market outcomes. So this idea of the sector in terms of a market is creates a very narrow view of how the system is understood. The third point in regulation is a conflicting mandate. Ofwat is required to promote the interests of consumers and to ensure that water companies can finance their activities. But these are conflicting. So if they intervene to promote the interests of consumers, it affects companies' ability to finance their operations. It risks their credit rating falling. It's a very difficult line to tread. And these are powerful investors. It's not just the water sector. We rely on private investment for all of our infrastructure finance. So this need to keep investors happy really limits the extent to which we can discipline capital. The fourth point is the close relationship between the regulator and companies. There's a revolving door between the two. The fifth point is regulation is very, very slow. It's inevitably slow. Ofwat was aware of financial engineering some time ago, but it's taken many years for them to actually bring in any changes. They had to bring in an act of parliament to enable them to change the license terms. So on the one hand, we have like privatization is meant to be nimble and effective and efficient, but inevitably it runs up against the state, and inevitably the state is slow. But more than that, the state is always on the back foot. This is the final point in regulation. We know information asymmetry exists in regulation, but in the UK, in England and Wales, this information asymmetry is profound. We didn't know that they weren't investing in infrastructure. We didn't know about their financial strategies about hiking up debts. We're always only finding this stuff out when it becomes visible, by which point it's catastrophic. So I'm skeptical that we will ever be able to have a regulatory structure that's going to generate a water system that's equitable and sustainable. I just want to finish by saying what's next. So I'm very pessimistic and I'm very optimistic about the future. I was trying to think about this morning. What do I think? So things have got really extreme, I think. So Thames Water, the case of Thames Water and the new loan makes it clear there's no appetite for change. Whatever companies do, we'll prop them up. We'll maybe tell them off, but we'll let them carry on. And I think customer bills will go up, things will calm down, and we'll carry on running our water system in the interest of global finance. But I'm also very optimistic because there's been some amazing campaigning and protesting taking place. So, the sewage leaks came to light through public campaigns. People are organizing around boycotting bill payments because companies have really let them down. And Dave might talk about this a bit more as well. It's an issue that's really galvanized people. So I think it's really interesting times. we got a huge, powerful global finance involved behind some of our water companies. They don't want to lose money. They're really putting the pressure on. But people are really struggling financially and they're appalled at what's happening and they don't want to be ripped off. So I think it's really interesting, not just for water, but I think it's a real interesting moment, like for global capitalism in general, really. Right, it's my quick romp through our water system. I'm going to stop. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kate. Many thanks for that very insightful, brief, but yet very pointed presentation. Excellent. Thank you. And we will have time to ask Kate questions, but I'm now going to hand over to David Hall for his presentation. David, you should be co-host, which should allow you to share your PowerPoint slides.
I think so. I shall try and do that if I can. Has that worked?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Very good.
Yeah.
Then we'll go back to the start. First of all, just to say, like Kate, thanks so much for the invitation, not only because it's very interesting and very great talking at seminars like this, but also it's so nice being reunited in the same virtual room with many old friends and more recent friends. And it's been one of the oddities of this crisis that because I've been slightly involved, people I haven't seen for 30 years ring me up and say, would you like to come and visit me again? And I'll show you the sewage running down our street, which is the great kind of social invitations that don't often happen. Okay, much of what I'm going to do can be considered to be a sort of, just a kind of commentary additional to what Kate's said. And I put together the PowerPoint partly because to try and put various slides and pictures together and graphics together that might be useful to you subsequently. So it's a kind of live archive as much as anything else. And the first couple of slides are going back to say, partly because there's some terrific graphics. This graphic is actually called Thames Water, and it's in the British Museum, and it describes Thames Water as a monster soup with what was in it in 1828. So this is nearly 200 years ago. And of course, it was exactly this kind of thing that led to the building of sewers in London to stop the cholera happening. But one highly relevant lesson is this cartoon's from 1828. It was another 27 years, I think, before the public sector started building the sewers. So you have both that process of resistance and the necessity of public sector intervention. Fast forward almost another century to 1895, and I know this looks like a particularly bad computer graphic, but actually it was done in 1895 when computing was in its infancy. This is hand-colored records display of the water companies of London's finances, and this pink wedge, as it was described, of avoidable costs is astonishingly similar to what we've seen now, namely actually a growing extraction of dividends by the 19th century water companies in London to the point where it was making up, the dividends were taking out about 30% of revenues. And that's uncannily close to the sort of level of financial extraction that we're seeing now. Once again, the final outcome of that was in 1903-04, municipalization. All the private companies were taken over and the Metropolitan Water Board was created. But once again, that was after something like a 35-year process of resistance by the companies. And on this slide, I quoted from a very good paper on the subject, pointing out that There are frequent references to lobbying by different companies, all of which have one or more MPs or lords on their governing boards. So the political processes we're experiencing that Kate referred to have also been experienced before. And one of the important kickstarts for getting to municipalisation was the creation in 1889 of London County Council, which was the first elected council for London, and that introduced a new, strong, powerful advocate. So those issues can be seen from that period as well, and they're not dissimilar. Sewage pollution, which Kate referenced, and so on, and talked about the scale of it. One of the main point of showing this slide is as a correction to what the companies say, which is it's caused by climate change. Because of climate change, we get far more rainfall. There's far too much rain going into the drains and sewers, and that means that the sewage is spilling. They also talk about population growth, which produces more sewage, of course, inevitably. The second point is correct, but then that's what we have water and sewage companies for. They're supposed to invest enough to adjust to population growth or indeed climate change, but they don't. And 3 times over, studies of sewage pollution overspills have shown not just that they are frequent, but that an astonishingly high percentage of them are happening due to inadequate capacity in sewage treatment plants. In other words, underinvestment and failure to invest. And that's highlighted by the extent to which there are sewage spills, even in dry weather, even when it isn't raining. Those figures show that. So that key link between underinvestment and the sewage, the financial issues and the sewage, is fairly clear. At one point, we own at one of the campaigns started calculating every time sewage goes in your river, ka-ching, the shareholders of your water company are £805 better off, and that link from underinvestment is quite graphic. This is a really difficult slide about investment, but to my mind, quite an important one. Is based on work by young LSE postgraduate Carol Yearwood, who did a paper 5-6 years ago, in which he showed that for virtually every year after the first 2 or 3, consumer bills produced enough money to pay for not just operating costs, but for all capital expenditure, with still a surplus remaining. In other words, capital expenditure throughout all this period. Last year it changed, but I suspect that's the first year since 1993 that it was true. This has not been financed, but the capital investment has not been financed by capital. It's been financed in the way that public authorities everywhere in the world and historically have always tried to finance capital investment, namely you increase charges briefly to bring in more money while you're doing the capital works, and then you can drop the charges again. So it's a non-capitalist method of investing, in my view, and I find that quite interesting because it can be seen as another strong argument against privatization. The privatization's supposed to bring capital, but it doesn't. This table comes from a paper we did last year, which was people kept asking, but surely the shareholders that have invested some money over the years, how much have they actually invested? So we used a very simple methodology to count that up. And to our amazement as well, the answer is not just not a lot, it's not just nothing, it's less than nothing. That actually shareholders over the years have withdrawn the share equity on the books, not just the face value, but the premium as well. And in real terms, that's dropped. And so it amounts to a withdrawal of equity by the shareholders, not an injection of equity by the shareholders, the reverse of the process. When you add up that, nevertheless, at the same time, the dividends have been extracted regularly again and again and again, which is supposed to be a return on capital, a reward for, an incentive for equity investment by shareholders. The figures we estimated come to, at that time, it's a higher figure now, came up to 85 billion being extracted at current prices. That figure is being extracted over the 35 years by shareholders, not an injection. Similarly with debt, debt has been building up, has piled up. I mentioned that on the previous slide. Kate mentioned that as well. But this is a slightly obscure graph from Carol's work. But what it shows is simply the broad correlation between increases in debt year by year by year, and debt has increased year by year by year, and the level of dividends paid. Because Carol showed that there was a surplus to pay a small dividend, as it were, but the debt was taken on not because it was needed to finance investment, that was already covered by consumer bills, but in order to finance dividends. And you can see that fairly close correlation between the figures continues. It's a phenomenon that exists not just here, it's in the USA. I think it's been referenced as dividend recap, something like that. And Senator Elizabeth Warren, about 10 years ago, was saying, this is shocking, it shouldn't be allowed, utility companies shouldn't be allowed to do it. So clearly it happens there as well. But that simple, astonishingly crude thing of borrowing money to pay yourself more dividends is a real issue. This is just a small summary table of some of those key factors: the cumulative dividends paid, the reduction in equity, the total extraction by shareholders, and the parallel accumulation of net debt. And those are the figures up to March last year for all the companies and for Thames explicitly. So, I mean, it shows the sources of some of those financial problems. Now, we've just done a new paper which people keep saying, okay, well, how much, would public ownership make any difference to the financial issues? And how much of a difference, and how can one compare that? And there's always sort of problems with making reasonable comparisons. But as Kate pointed out, in the UK, we do actually have a wonderful little test bed. Namely, Scotland defiantly said, we are not doing anything as stupid as water privatisation just because England's doing it. And so we can compare what's happened in Scotland, which has been and still is in public ownership. And no one is advocating that Scotland should change to adopt the English model. You can see there on the left-hand side of this slide, what we did was simply look at the finance costs of the English and Welsh companies, interest and dividends, as a percentage of total company revenues. And then the same for Scottish Water. And that two-part graph is two ways of looking at the same difference. Firstly, on the left, that shows that 35% of all the English and Welsh company revenues are going straight out. I like to describe it as financial diarrhea. It goes straight through the system into the pockets of creditors and shareholders without financing, without paying for any operations or any investment. With Scottish Water, it's only 8%. Obviously, there's no dividends, but also the amount of interest they're paying is low. and that's as much because they've got low debt as because of low interest rates, interestingly.
Three
The
more
columns on the
minutes,
right,
David.
okay, the columns on the right show the same thing, but as a percentage of investment. So you can see how much more investment could be made if there was that shift from private to public ownership in England. And those other columns there show that despite all this, that Scotland's actually been consistently investing about 50% more per household than England and Wales. This concerns the role of Ofwat, and Kate mentioned this in the conflicting role of Ofwat, and this is an obscure but very illuminating bit of information that Ofwat released uh, at the end of last year, not in their main reports, but only in their presentations to the city. And that was probably because the key thing of that, I've highlighted the line, the red line down below, the revenue that Ofwat decides to allow companies is based on a number of factors, but including critically return on capital. And out of the total revenue, the Ofwat's price increases awarded meant a total increase in revenues of 22 billion, and half of that, 11 billion, was due to Ofwat increasing the return on capital. So it's a huge factor. The Ofwat come down clearly on the side of the companies after being put under huge pressure. I mean, it's a very, very hard negotiating process. Okay, so we tried to calculate, and this is a paper that's coming out next week, how much more money the English water companies would have for investment and so on if it was in public ownership. Okay, quick run through now on the politics. Firstly, there's huge public support for public ownership. This figure shows 82% of the public supports public ownership. Interestingly, huge similar numbers for most other utilities and services as well. That Britain is not a country of people in love with privatization. Secondly, that position is pretty even across the political board. It's not a party political issue as far as voters are concerned. 70% of Conservative voters want to see water in public ownership. 90% of Lib Dem voters. These are across the board issues. And that's been true all along. One of the things that in the 1980s was that there was a big and successful campaign, and I'm old enough to remember participating in it, against Thatcher's initial proposals in 1985, and they were so strongly opposed that Thatcher actually withdrew them because it obviously looked like a bad thing to go into an election with. After she won the next election, she reintroduced them, but it was hugely unpopular. And at the point of privatization in 1989, July 1989, public opposition to water privatization was 79%, pretty close to what it is now. And so I think it's in understanding the politics. We need to recognise that all this hasn't happened because of lack of public opposition. What's happening at the moment? The government is above all resisting public ownership, has described it as in no one's interest. One interesting question is, why is the government resisting that so strongly? And I think there are two factors here, but one is a concern, some of which has something to it, some of which is made up, and that is concern about transferring the debt of the water companies onto the government books, because then it would look bad. And the other is a sort of an ideological distancing thing that Starmer's concerned above all to show that he's not going to be doing the things that Corbyn said he would do, or things that can be seen as socialist ideological moves by international finance capital. And so is tempted to be seen to be addressing the issue by setting up an independent commission, which has started its work, and he's told it can consider anything except public ownership, which is extraordinary, and fair amount of credibility is lost there, both for the commission and for Starmer, I think. As Kate says, that much is pessimistic so far, but it's very optimistic that there's a string of campaigns which are taking various positions. The environmental campaigns are taking various positions. Some of them, particularly the bodies associated with landowners, are taking what I can kindly call a realist position, saying, oh, the government's never going to give public ownership, so we won't stand up and say we're in favour of it. Others are taking a more evidence-based view. And there's some quite interesting and not always typically English initiatives going on, I think, one of which is the People's Commission on Water, which is set up to fill the evidence-based gap left by the government's commission, which isn't allowed to consider things. And this is, with its titles implies, for the benefit of everybody, will consider everything. And it's set up by a bunch of academics, which include Kate Bayliss. This is not always something that there's not something that happens very much in England, I think. The other thing is that some of the campaigners, and we own it, are leading on this, are campaigning around the need to set up new democratic public institutions to take over. And so that is a slide of what Thames Water could look like. For most of us around the table, this looks like very familiar kind of graph of how democratic public water companies are organized around the world. But this is a sort of shockingly illuminating graphic in the UK situation. So I, as ever, am an optimist, and there's lots to play for, and we can see what happens. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you also to you, David, for that fantastic, fascinating overview of what's happening, going right back to the late 19th century and very similar problems and the wave of municipalizations which happened then. So we've advanced a bit in the time. We've got about 10 minutes for question discussion. So I would suggest, David, if I could ask you to stop sharing your PowerPoint slides, please. So
yeah,
everybody...
I shall try and do that.
Thank you. Yeah, that has worked. So perhaps if we take a few questions or group, and then I hand over to you, Kate and David, for a final response at the end of the seminar, before then shifting over to Andrea. So who would like to raise an issue, please? If you could indicate electronically so I can call you. Moment of reflection. Yes, Alex.
It was really a question. I'm not sure if it's for Kate or for David, but if you could say a bit more about the People's Commission, because when we met back in October, there was a lot of concern about the Global Commission on the Economics of Water and what that was claiming. And I wondered if the People's Commission, although focused more on England and Wales, is in part trying to do something a bit different from the Global Commission.
Thank you, Alex. Who else would like to raise an issue? Yes, Emanuele.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks to both Kate and Dave. That was really brilliant. Now, Kate, you at one point you said, okay, well, you know, this thing about profits is due to privatization, is not financialization. This group, as I understand, is quite interested in financialization, and I would like to invite you to discuss the fact that, you know, financialization and privatization may also be going hand in hand. In fact, you know, well, my guess is that the pressure for rent-seeking pressures due to financialization are piling up on top of the pressures for rent-seeking of the utilities, of the private companies. What's your view on that? Discuss, please. Thanks.
Thank you, Emanuele. And Leo, I think I take, if there's no other indication, I take you as our final contributor, Leo, and then I hand back to Kate and David. Over to you, Leo.
Now, I was wondering about this discussion about regulation. I think it's a big issue. And my point is, what about the regulation of the public services? Are the limitations of the regulation to the private services similar to the regulation of the public service? For instance, in Scotland, how the regulation operates, in which extent they can control the public service in order to deliver what is intended to do.
Thank you. Good question. Yeah, public is not automatically better. Yeah, so it's also a question, how can that work then? Thank you, Leo. So perhaps, Kate, if you respond first, and then I pass over to David.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, interesting questions. First, Alex, this isn't about the Global Commission. I just want to say this is in response to the public inquiry that has been commissioned to look at the UK water sector. So the government said it was going to do an inquiry into what's wrong with the water system, and it basically, as David said, is very limited. It's only looking at regulation, and it's not, and a lot of it's being held like behind closed doors. So this is led by a particularly dynamic campaigner, and then there's four of us academics sort of come together on this. So I put a link to it in the chat. We're sort of holding some public meetings, which is also working around these sewage campaign groups that have come together. So the idea is that we are holding public panels, a public debate, and then we're going to write our own interpretation on what needs to be doing. One of the first session is next week. It's on the 27th of March, and it's about international water systems, and it's what can we learn from other countries, which is a huge gap in what the official government commission is doing. So yeah, lots to say about the Global Commission, but that's not what this our People's Commission is about. Emanuele, on financialization versus privatization. I mean, there's huge amounts written on this. What is financialization? Is it and lots of different definitions. To my mind, financialization is about these financial practices that are coming in, financial engineering led by financial investors, setting up via tax havens and all kinds of things. It's where people are making money through financial means rather than productivity, but also that doesn't mean that organizations, profit-led companies, are not also extractive. So I think the boundaries are blurred, but I think perhaps the sort of the rentier motive and capacities are accentuated when you have private institutional investors at the helm, as I was saying. And I think that's fairly well established in the literature that private equity funds use particularly aggressive tactics to extract from the companies that they own. On regulation and Scotland, I'll leave Dave to answer that question. But there is embedded in this private system a lack of transparency and a kind of adversarial structure that inevitably, I think, makes it harder to control what's going on in the sector. But I'll leave Dave to answer more on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. Dave, over to you for the final.
Okay. On Alex's questions on the People's Commission, Kate has dealt with that. I'd just like to pick up and emphasise the importance of what Kate said about its holding public meetings and hearings. because one of the things that's been very striking, I mean, the last few weeks, I've done a couple of meetings at Labour Party branches, or other people have done meetings in public, and there's a huge energy around once you open this debate to the public. People are very concerned, very angry, and overwhelmingly want to see public ownership, even in Tory backwaters deep in the Cotswolds. So it's an important initiative. But secondly, I mean, as Kate says, that it's just for England and Wales, but is it worth discussing whether a similar People's Commission could be set up to counter the UN's Global Commission, if that's a way of dealing with that and organising public hearings again? Financialisation, I have nothing to add. And Leo's question on regulation, three comments really. Well, a couple of comments before I talk about Scotland a bit. The first is that in the US, my understanding is, and it seems to be sort of repeated and confirmed, that the US takes the view that if you have public ownership, you don't need a separate regulator because public ownership controls what happens in the public interest, which is what a regulator should have been for. So under public ownership, you don't need a regulator. I think that's a very sort of straightforward and powerful argument, and the argument for the necessity of regulation tends to have emerged as a way of arguing for the necessity of privatization, as it were, that it's important to show that. But regulators in that sense are almost by definition, and this is true with Ofwat, politically unaccountable and publicly unaccountable, and therefore far more liable to capture, as has happened very easily, really, in England and Wales with the move of people. The position in Scotland is they set up a regulator because it was felt that they needed to look like it was being as serious as England. But the regulator's always been very supportive of public ownership. There's been a change of personnel, and also there's a different style and process. One example, I mean, I just started looking at this, is that the plans for investment and so on, which in England and Wales are just produced by the private companies and sent to Ofwat, and anyone who's tried to read them will have given up on page 250, which is the intention of writing 250 pages of that. Whereas in Scotland, they're structured as part of a formal public discussion and then agreed between Scottish Water, the Scottish Department of Environment, and indeed the regulators and the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, so that it ends up being Scotland's plan. It's a public plan, and the then important parts of it are particularly earmarked for constant scrutiny and public debate by the regulator. So I think Scotland may be an example of how a regulator can function in a private public ownership context as an enhancer of democratic participation.
Thank you very much, David. That brings us to the end of our first part in today's meeting. Many thanks to Kate and David for their excellent presentations. This was really, I find, an excellent start to our lunchtime seminar series. I'm now going to hand you over in the trusted hands of Andrea for information about the network. I apologize, I have to bow out. It's not just the water sector, but also the higher education sector in the UK, which is in deep crisis. And at the University of Nottingham, we from the union have a meeting with our management scheduled for now at short notice. But Andrea, over to you. And again, many thanks to everyone for coming along, and many thanks especially to Kate and David. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
very
you.
much. Thank you, Andreas, for moderating this session
Thank you.
also. Yeah. Mira actually will take the word now. If you
Sure.
do,
Yeah.
I think what we'll
No.
do in the next half hour. Well, first of all, let's switch off the recording.
Yes.
And